So I am Rosamond S. King, as we continue to let people in, just to let you know who's talking to you. I am a professor in the English department here at Brooklyn College. I'm also the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute of Humanities, which exists to provide enrichment events and programming for the campus. And so I'm so happy to be here, finally, because we planned this for March, with the opening event of the 2020 Robert L. Hess Scholar-in-Residence Program. When you're dark-skinned, it helps to have a light for the technology. This is the largest scholarly event on Brooklyn College's campus, or in our virtual campus, for the year, and we thank the Hess family for providing the gift that continues to support events since 1993. You can find more details about the history of this program, register for other events if you only came to this, if you only plan to come to this one. There's a whole bunch of other events for the whole week at our website, brooklyn.cuny.edu/wolf, which we'll put in the chat. We're very pleased that the president of Brooklyn College has joined us for this opening event to mark its importance to our community, and I would like to invite our president, Michelle Anderson, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Rosamond King, and welcome everyone. I am so happy and honored to be here, and really I want to thank Professor Rosamond King for her outstanding leadership of the Wolf Institute. This is hard work, and I want to thank you for engaging in it. I want to begin by just acknowledging, I won't do the introduction of our special guests. That will happen later in the program, but I just want to acknowledge our special guests, Jaskiron Dhillon, George Stonefish, and Winona LaDuke, the 2019-20 Robert L. Hess Scholar-in-Residence. It is such an honor to have this outstanding group of individuals with us to kick off this week-long series, particularly at this moment in history when society is really facing the grave consequences of failure to address environmental degradation and the abuse and undermining of rights of Indigenous people and of people of color more generally. It's particularly an honor to host this group of individuals here because they have dedicated their lives to raising awareness of and tackling these critical issues. And especially because tackling these issues aligns so closely with the fundamental mission of Brooklyn College, which is to serve an incredibly diverse student body, to make them citizens of the world. Many of them are first or second generation immigrants to this country, and they are tremendously diverse. The annual lecture and Scholar-in-Residence program is possible, as Rosamond mentioned, because of the Hess family's ongoing gift via an endowment in honor of the former president of Brooklyn College, Robert L. Hess. The lecture series has honored President Hess's vision by consistently bringing scholars who are at the top of their fields to enrich the academic and cultural life of this campus and to encourage our students to become independent thinkers and, again, to think of themselves as citizens of the world. I want to thank the planning committee for its tremendous work in putting together this whole program of week events, particularly in this online format and despite the challenges that we face during this uncertain time. I also want to acknowledge again Professor Rosamond King for her role in organizing this important event, as well as the entire week-long series of events for the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities. The Wolf Institute provides an essential and distinctive forum for intellectual exploration at Brooklyn College, and it's really embraced by the entire Brooklyn College community. I want to turn it back over now to Rosamond King for introductions of our special guests. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Anderson. We really appreciate you being here and your support for today and for all of our events. And I would like to now introduce George Stonefish. And I'm going to give relatively brief introductions because everyone is so esteemed. And you can find their details via your favorite search engine on the internet. But George Stonefish is a lifelong resident of New York City and a well-known First Nation member who has spent most of his life working for the First Nations communities on both national and local levels. He's on the board of directors for the American Indian Community House, which is a co-sponsor of these events, and we're so happy about that. And I'm pleased that he's with us to acknowledge the land. We knew that we had to incorporate a land acknowledgement for this week in particular, but this is something that we are doing more and more at Brooklyn College at all of our events. And so we're very pleased to have you here, George Stonefish, to do that for us.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that my name is George Stonefish, but I am a Lenape and Ojibwe First Nations person. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with who the Lenape are, in sum, we're the ones that met the Dutch. We greeted all the first explorers to the Turtle Island, and we were the ones that provided sustenance and survival for them upon their arrival. And we greeted them as brothers and sisters to this colony and this Turtle Island, what we call Turtle Island, or the United States continent. And as a result, we looked on them as partners into the future. However, land and their need for it and their greed got in the way to such an extent that they basically chased all of the Lenape people, and we were from just below Albany all the way down to the state of Delaware. They chased us all from our homelands here, all across the United States and into Canada, so that now we only have territories, and there's 2 in Oklahoma, one near Bartersville, Oklahoma with the Cherokee, and then there's one in Anadarko. Then we have another settlement way up in Wisconsin, right next to the Menominee, and then we have 2 more territories, and these are just federally recognized territories. We have 2 in Canada, where I'm from, Riven-on-the-Thames First Nation, and then also Munsee up in Ontario. And there are 2 state-recognized territories that have been left, one in the northern part of New Jersey in the Ramapo Mountains, and then in the southern part of Jersey in the Nanticoke people. And then there's a small settlement in the state of Delaware, which is a break-off from the Nanticoke, who are right on the border. Now, we've all had different journeys in getting there, and we've all traveled throughout the United States. It's like my territory. We traveled all the way down to Oklahoma, through Kansas, and all through the United States, settling and being massacred and being chased. And so we eventually went through what I guess would be the Detroit-Windsor border into Ontario. And we were chased to our present location now, and we were massacred one last time by the militia of the colonists at our present location. And we had with us Tecumseh, and he died in the battle when we were massacred, and we buried him on our territory. Now, because of this, people are really unaware of, if you ask them what Indians or what First Nation people met the Dutch and the English when they first arrived, nobody knows. The only thing they know is that we supposedly received $24 in beads and trinkets for the island of Manhattan. That's the fable, and that's the way it is, and that's partially the truth. However, when they arrived here, one of the things that we did for them is, we had this belief that all people should have the freedom to believe and to think as they wish, as long as they don't try to impose those beliefs upon others. So we welcomed the arrival of the Dutch and so forth, and we helped them to survive, and we provided sustenance and taught them how to farm, and taught them how to hunt in this area that was alien to them. And when they first arrived, when we first broke bread with them, we acknowledged the land and acknowledged our responsibilities as people in the following way. And I'm going to say this in English so that you know and understand how we pray and how we give thanks. And basically we would say, Creator, thank you for allowing us to have the earth, the moon, the wind, and the stars. Continue to follow their directions as handed down by the Creator, to provide us with guidance, to provide us with light, to provide us with heat. and to provide a means of our women to follow their moons. And as they continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator, we give thanks. We also want to give thanks to the winged creatures who fly here and there, who provide many things from feathers for ceremonies, to meat for a meal and sustenance, and also help to provide a direction to nature so that our seasons are maintained and continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. And then we would like to give thanks to the trees and the grass and the green and those things that grow, who help provide us with the ability to create shelters and provide sustenance and shelter for the four-legged and winged creatures that populate this earth. And they continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. And for many of them, such as the maple tree, to provide us with syrup and sugar substitute for us, and continue to follow the instructions as handed down by the Creator. And then we would like to give thanks to the three sisters, corn, bean, and squash, who when they are planted and grown together assist each other in providing the resistance to pestilence and support for the other to grow and nutrients for the earth, so that they all grow in larger and stronger manner and continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. And for that we give thanks. And then we give thanks to the various berries and so forth, such as the strawberries, which we give thanks for every season. And they continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. And then we want to give thanks to the four-legged creatures that populate the earth, that give up their lives for us to provide sustenance with, and give us their furs to provide warmth to our population and to our youngins, and continue to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. And if I have forgotten to give thanks for something, please forgive me, because it is because of my youth. And at this time, I will give a brief silence, for which everybody in their own minds, if I have forgotten anything, can give thanks for those things that continue to follow your instructions. Thank you. And I want to give thanks for our brothers and sisters who have come here today to help us celebrate and understand our existence and our responsibilities as they were handed down by you, the Creator, and that we will continue to follow them and live in harmony with each other as we were originally instructed to do so. Yahweh. And I would like now to close this land acknowledgement with an honor song for all of you who have come to participate here and to be part of this doings, this celebration. Alushka cheke na chikeno, alushka cheke na chikeno, hagichi walo, alushka cheke na chikeno, 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 hagichi walo, alushka cheke na chikeno, alushka cheke na chikeno, alushka cheke na chikeno, hagichi walo, alushka cheke na chikeno, alushka cheke na chikeno, alushka cheke na chikeno. Thank you. Now, the other thing I would like to just explain before I take my leave is that one of the things you should have noticed that when we prayed and gave thanks, that we as Native people never asked for anything. And it is not our way to ask for those things, but only to give thanks for everything that has been provided for us and which continues to follow their instructions as handed down by the Creator. We believe in doing that. We respect all things. And we respect especially those things that occupy and provide their continuing to follow their instructions on this Turtle Island, which is the basis for which we all live and survive, and that we continue to give thanks for. Yahweh.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stonefish, for giving us cultural information, factual information, and for everyone else, he's sharing with you some of the information that I found when I set out and said, oh, of course, we'll just find a Lenape elder and we'll work with them to do a land acknowledgement. And then I found out that so many of the Lenape have been forcibly displaced over the years that was much more complicated than I thought it was going to be. So I'm so happy we were able to have you come, Mr. Stonefish, and do this acknowledgement and really information sharing with us.
And thank you for having us. I feel very honored, especially to do this for my sister, Winona LaDuke, who I fear is a fearless leader and really, really is an example of the strength of our women.
Well, I think we're going to have a powerhouse example of the strength of women today with this conversation between Indigenous scholars on Native and Indigenous studies here and now. And I will briefly again introduce them. Jaskiron Dhillon is, like many of our students, a first-generation scholar. She describes herself as a first-generation anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on Treaty 6 Cree territory in Saskatchewan, Canada, who is now an associate professor of global studies at the New School here in New York City. So again, you can look up all the books that she's published and all the honors that she's had, but I really like the one-sentence summary that she has of her work. My scholarship, organizing, and teaching aims to work in the service of political movements advancing decolonization, justice, and freedom across the world. And of course, with Jaskiron Dhillon, we have Winona LaDuke, our 2020 Hess Scholar-in-Residence, who is an Anishinaabe Ojibwe rural development economist, a scholar, an activist, and as she has frequently reminded us, a farmer working on issues of economic, food, and energy sovereignty. And so Jaskiron Dhillon is going to speak a little bit first, and then Winona LaDuke will speak a little bit. They'll have a conversation amongst themselves, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. But we are embracing this digital format, so I encourage you to put questions and comments in the chat. We really want to hear from students, professors. If you want to nudge your students by linking what's being said to what you've been talking about in your classroom, that's great. And we'll keep track of your questions as you put them in the comments to make sure that we address as many as possible in the Q&A section. Thank you.
So I think I'm up next, right? All right. Welcome everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'd like to thank Professor King for inviting me to be here today, and to all of the organizers who made this event possible. Looks like you have an incredible week ahead of you with some really exciting and important discussions unfolding. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Winona LaDuke about the importance of Native studies. We've met several times. Actually first met Winona at a Tar Sense healing walk many years ago in just outside of Fort McMurray, Alberta. And I've learned tremendously from Winona's work over the years, and our paths have crossed in various moments. And so I'm really honored to be here to be able to share this virtual stage with you. So thank you for being here and being part of these conversations in New York where we so desperately need them. And I also want to thank George Stonefish for the land acknowledgement and the detailed sort of the way that you actually put us in conversation with some of the topics that we're going to discuss today in a real historical and also I think political way that many of us don't always understand or recognize. So thank you for that. All right, so I'm just going to jump right in and get started. So as Professor King mentioned, speaking to you today as an anti-colonial scholar and educator of color who believes it is fundamental that we consider the possibilities for research and teaching the power of knowledge to foster radical social transformation and decolonization across the planet. It is clear that being positioned in the academy is not the only avenue for pursuing social change, and perhaps not the most revolutionary or effective. But for those of us who occupy such spaces, we ought to be deliberating long and hard about what we are doing with them. We need to take seriously the responsibility of having acquired such a platform and be critical and self-reflective about how we conduct ourselves as writers and thinkers, as collectively as scholars trained in specific disciplines, and overall as human beings invested in liberation, justice, and the continuance of life for all living things, human and other than human. Of course, we know that universities and colleges are neither the beginning or the end point for seeking revolutionary change, but the work that we do in these spaces matters. In other words, for those of us who are invested in a decolonial project that transcends the pitfalls and perils of academic elitism, of which there are many, and who are engaged in social movement building outside of the academy with communities and collectives of various kinds, demanding radical changes in our universities is not a choice. Our lines of accountability follow us outside of the corridors and classrooms of our university homes, and those lines of accountability demand that we do something with the positions that we've acquired, as they should. What this means in practice is that we simply don't accept things as they are. We challenge, we push, and we advocate and agitate for changes that we believe are crucial for building a more just and equitable existence for human and other than human relations on the planet. Our task in the university is not easy, and it's not easy elsewhere for that matter either. We're living in a time when the world is teetering on the precipice of climate change, on a planet where millions of people are dispossessed and live in conditions of severe deprivation, a planet where fascism and authoritarianism are on the rise, where access to water is becoming increasingly precarious, and at the same time, massive floods are expected to displace millions of people, where migration is met with the increased securitization and militarization of colonial borders that are resulting in violent and deathly assaults on families and their relations, where children are separated from their parents and caged in detention facilities, entirely closed off from the outside world, where the murders of Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are sanctioned by the state and go unseen and often uncontested. We are living in a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has ravaged the world in different ways with varying degrees and scales of exposure, vulnerability, stress, and uncertainty. To say it simply, we need radical changes in our social, political, and economic systems, and we need them now. So what does this all have to do with decolonizing the academy by centering Indigenous resistance, history, and politics, you might ask? My response to that is plenty. Let's start with some basic ideas that are necessary to reiterate given what has been a glaring omission in terms of a structural focus on Indigenous politics, history, and resistance or Native studies at universities and colleges in the New York City area. And I've been working in New York City for close to 13 years now within institutions of higher education. And of course, there are exceptions within all of our institutions, comrades who are fighting from the inside attempting to change these things, as is the case at Brooklyn College. So the first point I want to make about why centering Native studies in our universities matters so much is that the United States, the land upon which all of these universities is built, is a settler colony. We have to accept that if we really want to understand how colonialism and US imperialism function in the world, that we need to critically understand how the United States came into being through Indigenous dispossession and slavery, of course. And this means that we have to pay attention and carefully center the scholarship and writing of Indigenous and Black scholars and researchers and thinkers. How can we teach and research about US imperialism and empire when we don't teach about the settler colonial formation of the United States itself? What difference does Indigenous territory make in political organizing and intellectual work addressed to imperialism and racism? How does recognizing the United States as a settler colony built on top of Indigenous homelands demand different pedagogies for our political movements, our frameworks of critical theory? How does positioning this land as Indigenous territory change understandings of the relationships and responsibilities of knowing, both here and in concert with struggles for liberation and freedom all over the globe? Colonial states do their best to carry out projects of imperialism, but people are never conquered. So we too must conduct our research, writing, and political organizing in a way that actively works to bring colonized peoples together. A related point then, which should be obvious by now, is that universities and other educational institutions are part of the problem. In Ebony and Ivy, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of American Universities, Craig Wilder meticulously examines the influence of slavery on the production and circulation of knowledge within colleges and universities in the United States. We learn from Wilder's work that college founders used enslaved peoples to raise buildings, maintain campuses, and enhance institutional wealth. Indigenous bones and artifacts were put on displays in universities as markers of victorious conquest, while lively discussions about the impending extinction of Indigenous peoples were hosted. At the same time, these institutions trained the personnel, including social scientists and those of us that work in the humanities and other disciplines, trained the personnel and cultivated the ideas that accelerated and legitimated land dispossession and horrific violence against Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, as well as the egregious enslavement of African peoples. Wilder reminds us that the academy in this country was founded to secure colonial interests, to make good on the divine promise of a white continent. Our institutions of higher education are directly involved in securing the decline of Indigenous nations and the reproduction of anti-Black violence, and in this very moment are implicated in actively supporting the continuation of colonial lifeways, social systems, and economic structures. This, in fact, is part of their productive power. I would also add that these critiques have been made by Black, Indigenous, and POC scholars and community scholars for a long time, including scholars from the Global South. This is not new. If we want to decolonize the academy, we need to be real about the history of these institutions by recognizing them as settler universities, as Sandy Grande reminds us, and as grounds of contention, as Daniel Heath Justice points out. Only then will we be able to unveil the logics, discourses, and practices through which colonial violence, erasure, and elimination continues to be possible. We have to ask ourselves, whose histories are we holding up? Whose knowledge has become our canons? Whose resistance to various forms of colonial violence become constituted as criminal, anti-American, or as threats to national security? Whose futures are we destroying through our epistemic violence? Who lives? Who dies? A second point I want to make about why Native Studies matters so much is that if our institutions of higher education are committed to being intellectually and politically responsive to the current social moment in which we find ourselves, of which many do, we are missing a big piece of the puzzle. Let me give you two examples. I think I can say with confidence that the majority of us listening to this event today care deeply about the fate of our planet, that we wake up at night thinking about issues of environmental justice and climate change. Indigenous history, politics, epistemologies, and resistance have much to offer us, not just in helping, but in actively providing leadership and an aggressive agenda to mitigate climate change. Why? Indigenous peoples across the planet currently protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. The climate science clearly tells us that land, water, and ecosystems that are under the care and governance of Indigenous peoples have been kept more intact in terms of species survival and retention to balanced ecosystems, less ravaged by the long-standing impact of global racial capitalism. Indeed, Indigenous peoples are holding the line against some of the most destructive and violent environmental projects, both slow and fast, across the planet. Suffice it to say, if we have a hope in hell of mitigating the impacts of climate change that have already been set in motion, we should be looking to our Indigenous comrades to lead us, to help expand and critically interrogate our conceptions of science, and to help us shape a different kind of future. Let me share one more example. Back in March, I had the privilege of spending some time with the members of the Native Liberation Organization, the Red Nation, who have been active in supporting undocumented migrants along the colonial US-Mexico border. And this has taken the form of traveling to the border to offer material supplies, organizing visits to detention centers, and speaking out against human rights atrocities. These organizers, some of whom are also university students and some professors, but some are community members doing various kinds of work, have been doing the hard political work of unpacking how systems of colonial oppression, white supremacy, and occupation, while certainly impact various peoples differently, are also co-constituted. That means they work together in tandem with one another. So this passage from Beyond Borders, the particular caucus of the Red Nation, captures this point best when they say, quote, "As unified members of the Beyond Borders caucus, we aim to build solidarity with those directly impacted by regimes of border imperialism that have historically devastated conditions of living for people that are now classified as quote unquote undocumented migrants. Various tribal governments along the US-Mexico border are also providing safe haven to migrants using the governing authority granted to them through their treaty rights. So a centralized focus on decolonization then is not about creating isolated silos in which all of us committed to this work can go about our business. It's about understanding and acting upon the foundational significance of decolonial knowledge, Indigenous history, and resistance in everything we do. So that is to say, to understand how Indigenous dispossession is actually tied to many of the social and political and historical inequalities that we're interested in fighting against. And I just want to spend a couple of minutes now just talking a little bit about how some of the work around indigenizing or decolonizing the academy has been taken up so that we get a sense of what the landscape looks like out there. Of course, some critical questions need to be asked. How do we produce structural change in our institutions of higher education? Who bears the burden of radical change? How are unequal power relations taken up in the initiatives that on the surface are developed in the name of decolonizing the academy? So I'm going to offer a couple of comments here briefly before I close that draw from this move, mostly drawing from my comrades in Canada who have been undertaking this work post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015. So one of the primary approaches that we've seen emerge in this sort of broader move to include or to integrate Indigenous knowledge systems is around the politics of inclusion. So most people will be familiar with this since it is the standard protocol for diversity initiatives in most institutions of higher education. Inclusion looks like hiring 1 or 2 Indigenous faculty, retaining and recruiting a few Indigenous students, developing courses that address Indigenous politics and history. It's the add-on approach. So what's the problem with this? It integrates Indigenous people into a pre-existing colonial structure. It places the onus of change on the individual Indigenous faculty members or their allies and the few students. And it fails to rethink the university's underlying structure, which includes who governs the institution, sits on its board, raises money for it, and assumes that the university is neutral ground. Simply put, inclusion is the low-hanging fruit of decolonization, and in the end, keeps hegemonic power structures intact. The next move that has sort of been put on the table is this idea of a reconciliation indigenization. And this approach emerged directly from TRC recommendations that attempted to go beyond the inclusionary measures to alter university structures by including programs to educate all faculty, staff, and students on how to change how they think about and act towards the Indigenous peoples of the territories upon which their universities are built. And also by addressing issues of power sharing, advancing the transformation of decision-making processes, and centralizing Indigenous people in the creation of policies that impact them. And on this front, the academy has fallen terribly short. Few institutions, if any, have adopted fundamental changes aimed at uprooting the established epistemologies and colonial methods of Western intellectual traditions, not surprisingly. Universities are great at aspirational language, but few offer commitments that follow through with them. And the final approach that I want to mention, which is the most radical, I think, and obviously the one that's most fervently advocated for by Indigenous scholars and their allies who are working towards really shifting the way a university operates, is reconstituting the university and rebuilding it back up with a very different purpose and role. And so this requires thinking about decolonization and indigenization within a treaty-based model of Indigenous governance and practice for the university, which is clearly very different than the governance of a board of trustees. So this would require, of course, treaty education. So it's really thinking about how a university would operate if you actually upheld the treaty obligations of that territory. If you understood the treaties upon which the university was built, on the land upon which the university was built, and then you actually implemented those. So ultimately, this form would redistribute intellectual privilege and work towards building and developing a whole new set of relationships that have reflected a reordering of the power relations and a decentralization of the administrative control. And those of us that are, attempting to change university structures know how centralized administrative control is within institutions of higher education. So decolonization cannot be an empty conceptual signifier used throughout the academy, appropriated, co-opted, and manipulated to serve colonial ends. It must be about shifting power. I'll close by saying that this political responsibility, and I'm sure Winona would agree with me, for change must be shared. It calls for radical solidarity and building with our white allies and comrades within the academy, those people who are willing to take risks in material ways. And this requires, of course, that people show up to do the work to educate themselves about political and epistemological dimensions of change that need to happen alongside the material ones. And then it requires that we show up to do this work. So it remains to be seen, of course, whether or not a true decolonial project is even possible within institutions of higher education. My hope, however, is that we continue to try. Thanks.
Thank you so much for all that food for thought. I'll go straight into Winona so you all can have a conversation.
Yeah, Ani Nindue Maganito, hello, my relatives. Nice to see you and be with you out there. Just really grateful for this opportunity and for your opening remarks. As I kind of reflect on this moment, I mean, we are all looking in the same world, and maybe I live here in the middle of the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota, but I see a multiple set of crises around us. You got a political crisis, you got a social crisis and a social movement, which is toppling statues. You got a health crisis that is unknown, you know, in our history. You have ecological crisis, and we'll just go with catastrophes of biblical proportions. Now would be a good time for us to work together, you know, to have the solutions that need to be made. And academia has a very significant role in this as an opportunity. Now I'm going to go a little bit down the path of, you know, so I was in school a long time ago, like last century and all. And I remember being an undergraduate at Harvard University in this moment when I was, you know, member of the American Indian movement, and we were working on frontline struggles in our communities. We were getting, you know, this invasion of multinational uranium corporations coming into our neck of the woods. And, you know, so I went back to school, and I'd go work in a community, and then I'd come back to Harvard, and I'd write research papers that would be of some relevance for the community. Right? That's kind of how I was schooled. Is it seemed to make a lot of sense at the time, because there was this absolute division between the resources, political, social, academic, technical, of like the Dene or the Navajo community, and the guys at Harvard at the Center for Science and International Affairs who had all the data that these folks actually needed. Right? So I remember as a young woman saying, "Whoa. Looks like we should have, you know, we should get the information that is needed for our communities to the communities," right? So I remember being this person at Harvard and doing my best to keep up with my classwork. And I went to school with this guy from the African National Congress. His name was Masilo Mabeda. And he was a political refugee, ANC representative from South Africa. And he was a refugee, and he was at Harvard in the graduate school. And I remember one day I was sitting there in Adam's house with them, and these you know, white guys came in, of course, you know, and they look at us, and me and Masilo are at the table, and they said, I said to Masilo, "How come you work so hard?" And he said, "Because you refuse to work." I was like, there you go. That's really it, isn't it? We all have this opportunity and this privilege. Here we are in first world country, first world universities, and you know, the fact is that the world needs us to use these things as best as they can. And we need it to be clear, and we need to be coherent, you know, in all of this, which is, you know, the challenge in that it is always a challenge to be coherent, but particularly we want the best shot at it, you know? So as I reflect, and, you know, thank you so much for your comments, because it is true, the university needs to provide the space for coherence. You know, that is part of where we need to be. We need to be, first of all, deconstructing, you know, as we said, and decolonizing a lot of the thinking that is in there, because as an Indigenous person, having gone to these institutions of higher education, you always had to like unpack a lot of other people's bags to be able to be there. And like, you're always knowing, you know, you're quite aware of the fact that where you are holding your class, there are also the bodies of your ancestors down the hall, you know, a little bit of a challenge to your psyche as an Indigenous person, and you're expected to somehow overcome that. It's all good, just keep moving ahead, you know. That was particularly Harvard in the 80s, but, you know, some things have changed, and I'm sure some things have not, you know, because academia still has a lot of our bodies. But, you know, so there is the beginning of the essential process of kind of reconciliation. of these universities. And more recently, kind of in the broader, I wouldn't say recently, we knew about this, but land grant institutions, the land was granted, was taken from Native people. And so, there are these huge amounts of agriculture work and research with the appropriation of our land, and none of those benefits have derived to us. In fact, it's been a loss of agrobiodiversity, in part because of these land grant institutions. And so I'm just saying that overall, academia, not only, objectifying Indigenous people, but being based on the appropriation of the wealth of Indigenous people is systemic in the system itself. And that acknowledgement and that deconstruction and how we begin that, is essential to clear thinking. And then I look at kind of the issues that, some of the issues that we've raised, but, I have to be honest, it looks like that those guys don't have it together. I don't know exactly how to put that, but, it looks like you got a political crisis, an economic crisis, a health crisis, an ecological crisis. It means like that despite all of the learned words of policymakers and all of the academic advice and the studies and the programs and the postulations, we don't have this down. I don't know how else to put it, but we wouldn't be in this crisis if we actually knew what we were doing. So humbly stated, I would say that it might be time to turn to some people that have a little experience in both, one, being post-apocalyptic people, that's us, we're the people who have survived, are still hanging in there after essentially apocalypse, right? So we know how to hang in over the long haul. That's what I would say. There's probably a few lessons in that, get humble, try to survive and not be all about conquering and conquest. Always good reviews, Second is how do you create systems that are healthy? Humbly stated, I don't really think the United States has a particularly healthy set of systems. We don't want to return to normal because normal was kind of dysfunctional, I really like the words of Arundhati Roy, and I'll probably be using them throughout this week, where she talks about pandemic as portal. Pandemic as portal. What a brilliant, brilliant woman, And she talks about the coronavirus has made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and dirty skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And that is really this moment. It is this moment in time, and academia has such a significant role in this. So, I'm coming to you from the White Earth Reservation, and I tell you what, is the issues and the academic disparity between the technical knowledge and a lot of the things that, would help us in our frontline work of transforming to being in the just transition, making the new world that we all want. We could use a little academic help in that, The same issues that I was facing as an undergraduate at Harvard 30 years ago of what exactly is the impact of radiation exposure to Indigenous peoples over a 20-year time period and who has those statistics. Well, all of that data, we have the same set of questions today in some other arena. And what you'd often need is to have some academic support or an interaction between academia and your community. That's to say, I have a privilege of lecturing with you, and I have a privilege of lecturing at a lot of universities historically, and you go there and you're thinking, well, I'm going to talk about this time, but then in the end, what will we do with this knowledge? What will we do to make a difference in the world that we all will be living in? What will we be doing? And so I look at examples of Indigenous thinking, saying that those guys don't got it. I give you example, like restorative justice. Restorative justice is an Indigenous construct. The United States doesn't have a restorative justice system. It has a punitive justice system. We got 2 million people in jail, more per capita than anybody else in the world. And that is really not a sustainable strategy, is jailing people. and the inequities of the criminal justice system are widely known. So there's the inequities of the sentencing and the practice and the driving while Indian or Black Lives Matters. And then there is also the fact that what we need to do is create systems that heal communities and not further cause more trauma, in those communities with the justice system. We need to look at things like economic systems. I refer to this, and this week I'll be discussing more of Wendigo economics, the economics of a cannibal. That's really the United States economic system. It's a capitalist economic system of consuming more than you need and not leaving the rest, of widespread, just consumption. A Wendigo is an Anishinaabe or a, indigenous cannibal. It's a cannibal. And this is early the economics of a cannibal. And so as we have come to the place where we have seen, the discretion of the forests, water, trying to get a little oil out of any place by fracking the bedrock of Mother Earth, the bottom of the barrel, time to come up with a plan that is a cyclical economy, a restorative economy, something that is not based on a linear economy. That knowledge is not contained in most academia. I'm an economics major. I'm an economist by training, but most of these institutions are still Keynesian economic strategies, which have no application in the reality of the world. So it is time to take indigenous thinking of sustainability and look at how you build economic systems that make sense and that give value, reaffirm relationship to place, to earth, to people in terms of justice, just economic systems. Similarly, issues like governance. I don't think there's many people here that would make the argument that the government is working well. Questions are, how do we build a government? How do we reaffirm governing systems? I think of the Six Nations, Iroquois Confederacy, and I like the idea. I mean, I've always been interested in when they bring a chief in, a new leader, and the term is called condoling a chief. And I think that there's a couple facets of that, which is like a lot different than running a multi-million-dollar campaign to be elected. The difference is this recognition that when you take up that leadership, it is a great burden for you. It is a great burden and responsibility. So we give you our condolences because you accept that responsibility. Wow, that's a lot different than an American political institution, And there's also the acknowledgement of the passing of the previous leader, So I think that kind of a shared governance systems and acknowledge different valuations of governance. For instance, I really often think that indigenous people, while, an economic system and leadership, like what is valued in indigenous communities is not necessarily how much you have accumulated, like how rich you are, and if you're in the Fortune 500 of individuals, but instead how much you have given away. That is a sign of good leadership, is if you are generous, and you understand and you have faith that when you give away, it'll all be okay because you will all take care of each other. Different systems, and that leads me to kind of this discussion of gross national product, economic analysis, and what we need is really far more the kind of work that's being done on a worldwide scale by indigenous people and others, but gross national happiness indexing. Building economic systems that are not based just on how much money you have, because that doesn't make you happy, and really looking at GNP and GNH, gross national happiness, which is really an indigenous indicator. I would say it's more like Minopamataziwan as a thought. So kind of having said that, there are a lot of reasons that we need to be at the table and taught, and we need to be present, because I think that it is time to come with solutions. I think it's time to begin, no time like the present. No time like the present to come up with some solutions. And those solutions need to come from a lot of places, and a lot of the wealth and the research that I even need here in my community are in academia. And so building those relationships that are accountable and work collectively to uphold these teachings and let them be shared as seeds. I think that is part of how I see the transition that we need in academia. Thank you.
Thank you. Jaskiron, do you want to maybe ask the first question and then we'll open it up?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Winona. As usual, so much to think about, so much guidance and wisdom. So one of the things that I think I've been thinking about as you were speaking, and then I've also thought about in my own teaching and research at the New School, and also with a number of Indigenous communities over many years, is when I think about raising these questions inside my university, one question that always comes to the forefront is, how do you build good relations with Indigenous communities as an institution of higher education that has a particular colonial history that actually is actively reproducing colonial dynamics in the world? How do you actually go about the work of building those good relations that enable us to actually develop the coherence in the solutions or the orientation to social transformation that you're advocating for, which I wholeheartedly agree, because I think many of us have been attempting to kick in the door, essentially like kick down the door in these institutions to create different pathways for imagining curriculum, for imagining teaching, for imagining the possibilities of research. And so what can you offer us based on your vast experience around what it means, what a beginning point can be for building those relations in a good way that doesn't reproduce the extractive model of pulling what you can in from Native people and then integrating it into a different kind of project that actually doesn't end up transforming anything?
Right. No, thank you. There's so much potential. I mean, on one hand, it's individuals like you. You got to start someplace in an institution, and I'm always like, just get going, just get started, and then we'll keep building it from there, because, getting the top to change, that takes the longest. But, and the top changes once they see the groundswell at the bottom, right? And they see, I've had very good success. I have a lot of students come see me out here. Even during COVID, I have people, coming out here, because there's also this recognition that while academia gives us this space to reflect and think and study and have dialogue, it also is not the real world. And so this way to relate to the real world and make sure that, a lot of the things that we are working on are on the cutting edge, and they aren't even in academia yet. So frontline it, figure out how to build some partnerships with some of these, whether it's the Lenape community there, whoever the communities are that are working, or it could be, across the Turtle Island, So I think it starts someplace, and then getting some practical pieces in order. Because I'm really a tangible person. I don't have time for a lot of big other things, but I have very specific, applications. And then you build trust and partnership and relationship. And then it starts to percolate through the different, those who have kind of got themselves all blocked in with their little academic, this is how it is. Well, everybody in academia knows that what you were teaching 3 years ago is probably not what you're teaching today. A lot of the foundations are the same, but we should hope that you have rewritten your notes. So, it is such a good opportunity. I don't know if that really answers, but I feel like that the opportunities are so many, to do such work, and you just got to get it started someplace. And then institutions need to give space and resources for that, because it takes resources to do this. And, not only, of many kinds, from researching at fellows, making sure that students get some work study or some credit for it, and then resourcing the organizations that you're partnering with, so that your exports or your folks like your George Stonefish, that they're able to participate in a way that isn't exhaustive and extractive.
Yeah.
Exciting though, super exciting.
Well, we're very excited to have you here. And what's interesting, I'm looking at the chat, the first few questions are actually very related. And so I'm going to kind of read them a little bit. We have a question about what reparations would look like economically, logistically, legally to Indigenous communities here in what we now call the USA. We have a question about what truth and reconciliation would look like and the obstacles in transitioning from a retributive justice system to a restorative one in the US. And also a question about the value, what you think the value is in celebrating or acknowledging Indigenous Peoples Day at an institutional level. Is that something that we should put effort into getting institutions to acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day? And so I'm throwing all of those out, and you can kind of answer whichever parts jump out at you. And I thank very much the students who asked those questions.
You want to take a shot at some of those, my friend?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm actually really, I'm intrigued, and maybe we could like think about this together, Winona. The question that's about the question that's about the, I feel like the question about reparations is actually linked to some of the questions around responsibility and accountability of institutions of higher education, right? So what does it mean to think through the politics of land reclamation, of retributive justice, of knowledge, access to knowledge and power and resources in institutions of higher education if you actually center the sort of Indigenous land dispossession and the history of colonization on these territories, right? So one way one could argue for the accountability and responsibility of institutions of higher education to do exactly all of the things you're saying, Winona, is through the lens of reparations, right? So this is actually a responsibility that you have. And I think the treaty obligations are tied to this also. So wondering what you think about that, like the sort of the tie-in between treaty obligations and a responsibility of the university to actually engage in a particular kind of material transference of power and resources because it's framed through that lens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the institutions themselves need to look at what this process looks like. And of course, I just think of Harvard University, that was before treaties, established for British and Indian youth. We didn't get back in there for quite a few centuries, right? After the first ones died of consumption, I think, early on, just that kind of exposure. And so these institutions that have a very clear, all institutions have a responsibility, and some of them have a very clear responsibility in their charters that they should manifest, in a way that illustrates that there is, and not just, as you've discussed it, it's also not just, having Native people in the schools, it's also having relevant material curriculum professors in these schools, because we're not trying to, that's the education that we need and we want, and we want others to have as well. I also think that these larger questions that, it is not that we have not been talking about reparations for my whole life, I think pretty much we've been talking about this for my whole life. But I look at this moment now, and, of course, Donald Trump and his just way to hit every spot, Juneteenth in Tulsa, 4th of July, and at Mount Rushmore. Come on. And then he just came to Bemidji this last week, and my God. Anyway, having said that, my point is that the discussion, for instance, of the Black Hills is a perfect example of what reparations looks like. The Lakota never accepted the settlement, and so as you look at the big picture, the largest landowners in the United States, Native people have 4% of our original land base, but federal, state, and county governments and the military, most of that was carved out of our territories. So the Black Hills All of those federal, state parks that were called out of Black Hills, those should be returned. That's what reparations looks like. You know, Glacier Park, Yellowstone Park, you know, I'm just saying that's kind of like the low-hanging fruit of all of these national parks carved literally out of our territories. I have the Tamarack National Wildlife Refuge and Itasca Park here on my reservation carved out entirely. So, you know, some putting some wind in that. I hate using the term wind in the sails because that sounds so colonial, but you know, the point is that academia having broader discussions about what reparations looks like and putting some examples in there, you know, is a really essential and critical dialogue, because right now, you know, that's not even in the bandwidth of most students. What does reparations look like, you know, for Indigenous people? And then I just look at things like the railroad. Half of the right-of-ways of those railroads, the intercontinental railroads, really are indigenous, you know, are indigenous. And so what does that mean as we create the solutionary rail, the new infrastructure for this country that is based on rail? Because why wouldn't you have rail instead of highway, you know, when you're trying to build the next economy? You know, we should have half of that. You know, basically Warren Buffett's share would be fine, you know, but my point is that, you know, there's tangible assets that, so it's not like a theoretical lot of research gig. You know, Bears Ears National Park, perfect example of the beginning of that process, you know, in the last administration. So I see great hope, and it's inside the institutions, but you know, I don't want to stay in the box. I want the whole thing.
And I'm curious, since there were several questions related to Indigenous Peoples Day, which of course is coming up. And for those of you who've never heard that term before, it is what many people are choosing to call what's known as Columbus Day. And whether you think it's worth it to put effort into having institutions like colleges and universities acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day, or whether you think that time is better spent on other endeavors.
I think it's great. Because, you know, to be honest, like, you know, I don't know how to put this, but I think of white people every day. But Indigenous people don't think of Indigenous people most days. You know, I always think we have like this opportunity between like Indigenous Peoples Day and Thanksgiving. That's like our month and a half of airtime, you know, where the people are like, oh yeah, the natives, I wonder how they're doing over there, you know, or something like that. You know, and I'm saying is that taking that and open it up, because the exclusion, the erasure of Indigenous history has caused a lot of stupidity in this country on many levels, you know, I mean, and it's, you know, it's quite obvious that nobody took the notes, you know, for what we've been saying for 150 years, like, quit messing with Mother Earth because you're not going to win a battle. Don't pick a fight with Mother Nature, you won't win. You know, I think we said that like 150 years ago, and it's still, you know, the same thing. And so beginning that discussion, letting people understand, you know, reaffirm relationship, figure out who is from there, you know, understanding that relationship, rebuilding relationship, acknowledging, feasting, as, you know, as is the tradition there. And then, you know, I think it's the most amazing year. I had no idea so many statues were going to topple in one year. You know, so let's, you know, my favorite is when it is that those statues should be replaced with someone of integrity. You know, time to start putting some Indigenous people on those Columbus Day statues. I'd say Columbus statues anytime would be good, you know?
Yeah, I want to just add on that to what Winona just said about the sort of the importance of Indigenous Peoples Day. And I think that, you know, these holidays can be critiqued for only being symbolic. Like, you know, you do it once a year and then it's over, and that's your, you know, that's your sort of gesture towards inclusion, is by celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day, and it can feel very surface level. But I think if we do what Winona is suggesting, which is to use it as a springboard for actually developing a much larger political agenda that is about reparations, that is about like the shifting of pedagogy and curriculum, that is about like actually addressing the relationship between the the original peoples of those homelands upon which the university is built, and thinking about what it means to develop long-standing relationships, then, you know, this holiday becomes, or this celebration of Indigenous Peoples Day actually becomes something much, much larger than that. And you can use it as a way to, you know, trigger a much larger set of political conversations and generate, I think, begin with the generating awareness, and then sort of build it out from there. You know, because I also agree with Winona in that, you know, and I would argue that, like, in academia, this is, like, especially a problem. You can get caught in sort of the rhetorical conversations about what to do without actually ending up materially landing on the ground anywhere, right? So one could have a committee that works on this for 2 years and has no material result at the end of it. You know, and what I'm hearing from Winona is that, you know, we actually don't have any more time to engage in a series of purely rhetorical conversations. We actually have to land on the ground. We actually have to do the work. We have to be materialists about what is possible, right? And that you begin somewhere. So whether or not you begin with Indigenous Peoples Day and use that as a springboard, or you begin with, like, one faculty member who's, you know, who's attempting to kick down the door and then attempting to generate support around that, but that you begin somewhere.
Thank you. And I want to give a shout out to Daniel Vasquez Sanabria and some of the other students in the chat, because at Brooklyn College, it's the students who are leading the fight to bring Indigenous Studies to campus and to acknowledge Indigenous Peoples Day. And it's the faculty who are happily following in their footsteps. And following on that, I might just ask a question. You know, we have a lot of faculty at Brooklyn College who are interested in doing more with Indigenous Studies, incorporating it into our curricula, but we do not have a single full-time person for whom that is their focus. And so my question is, again, on behalf of the students who are interested in finding this, finding this information and pursuing it. On the one hand, what tips do you have for them for getting more knowledge than what we might be able to provide for them at the moment? And on the other hand, a lot of our students feel torn between pursuing higher education and doing community work and seeing those two things as separate. And it seems like both of you have higher education and are working deeply in your communities. And if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to do both, or you do both. I mean, if you're in a position and you're going to school and that's what's feeding your soul right now, do that. And in that process, see what you can do to change the world, but it's a slow process and everyone has their different, I'm just saying, is in a different space in their life. And so, I just remember, and even to this point, there's a lot of technical needs or needs in these community groups that I would write my academic papers that would answer the questions that were needed in the community group, and I would turn it into an academic paper. And that's kind of a late. I mean, that's just the way that I did it. And professors, I did a lot of independent studies, but I just found that that is how I got through school, and it was good for my community and it was good for me. And I had a lot, I learned a lot of things that were like, they weren't in the textbook yet. I mean, that's the reality, is that history is getting made right now. History is getting made right now, and you don't want to miss out because your nose is on your computer and you missed the history. I mean, I see my people doing epic things right now, and I just wish I had more time to write about it or record it. I'm doing my best, but students, the balance between the world is your classroom and your classroom itself can be found, particularly, at your university. I mean, you guys you got this.
Jaskiron, would you like to comment on that too?
I'm not sure that I have anything else to add that one hasn't already captured in this moment. So I'm happy to, to leave it at that and take another question or hear another comment.
I'm not seeing any more questions, and we just have a couple of minutes left, so I'll let you all, if you want to make any quick final comments to leave with us, now would be the time.
One thing I could add to that conversation is just, you know, I think that one of the ways that we could think about connecting across the universities in New York City is that there are individual professors at all of our institutions in New York, I think, that are attempting to do this work. So one thing that we've been talking about as part of a consortium of professors and community members who are interested in building Native studies is, you know, creating more opportunities for students to attend events and take classes in other institutions. And so I think part of it is building a stronger network that allows us to actually understand what's already happening in New York City right now around these things might be helpful. So it feels less like one individual set of people are fighting in this institution, but we're actually thinking strategically about how we can do this work across the institutions that we're part of. So I know I have students that, you know, come from NYU and CUNY, and I've taught a class at Columbia and that enter my classes. And so there may be opportunities to think about the kind of, you know, network that we could develop in the city to actually help to advance this work and to share syllabi, because we all work in different areas, and that of course leads to resources. And we all have different kinds of connections to communities too that we've built over time. And to actually begin to do some of that work of developing those relationships in a politically responsible way, in a way that allows us to build, not to have it sort of as a one-time, one-off event, but actually to build the longer-term relationships that are going to be necessary to engage in this struggle and to win it.
No one, any final comments?
No, I just that, you know, that the moment is here, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you in this dialogue, and you know, just grateful. And as we look out there is change all around. So I intend to be at the table, and y'all should too, you know. And how you get there is being coherent. So this is our opportunity to write and to keep going. So
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, there's a lot of thank yous coming up in the chat, and people can give their claps or their Zoom thanks in whatever way is comfortable for you. Again, I want to thank George Stonefish for opening us up in such a wonderful way. And we did have this powerhouse conversation. Thank you so much for Jaskiron Dhillon and to Winona LaDuke. And thank you to President Anderson and to all the professors who brought your students. There's lots more happening this week. Please go to the website, register for the other events, and we will see you there. Thank you.
Miigwech. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.